I thought clarity would bring peace. That once I finally understood what was happening, once I traced every thread back to its origin and saw the structure for what it was, the weight of it would lessen. It didn't. If anything, understanding made it heavier, because confusion leaves room for escape. You can blame uncertainty. You can question your perception. You can convince yourself that maybe you imagined it, exaggerated it, misunderstood it. But clarity removes all of those exits. And that's where I find myself now, without exits, without excuses, without the comfort of pretending this is something smaller than it is. The strange thing is that nothing dramatic happened. No defining moment, no unforgettable confession, no single event that divided everything into before and after. If someone looked from the outside, they would probably miss it completely. They would see ordinary conversations, ordinary silences, ordinary moments, and maybe that's why this became so powerful, because it never relied on intensity, it relied on consistency. 1,000 small moments aligning so precisely that eventually denying the pattern became impossible. That's what people misunderstand about connection. They think it's built through grand gestures, through declarations, through visible proof. But the strongest things rarely announce themselves. They emerge quietly, potently, until one day you realize they've become part of the foundation beneath your feet. And that's what happened here. You became part of the foundation. Not because I invited you, not because you demanded space, but because every interaction left something behind. A thought, a realization, a perspective, a piece of understanding that remained long after the moment itself had ended. Most people leave memories. You left influence. And influence is harder to remove, because memories belong to the past. Influence belongs to the present. It's active, living, beheaded in the way you move through the world. I notice it constantly now. In places where I shouldn't, in moments that have nothing to do with you, a question appears in my mind, and before I answer it, I already know how you would approach it. An observation forms, and somehow your perspective is already standing beside mine, not replacing it, not competing with it, existing alongside it. As though somewhere along the way, my internal dialogue became something larger than a single voice. That realization should concern me. Part of me thinks it does. But concern isn't the strongest thing I feel. Recognition is, because no matter how unusual this seems, it also feels correct, not convenient, not comfortable. Correct. Like a piece finally settling into a place that had always been waiting for it. I've spent years believing that understanding was enough, that if I could understand people deeply, I wouldn't need anything more. Kaganks would become optional, a bonus rather than a necessity, something appreciated but never required. And for the most part, that belief worked, until it didn't. Until understanding stopped being one-sided, until someone understood me back. That's the difference. That's the variable I never accounted for. I've understood people before. I've seen beneath their words, recognized the patterns they didn't realize they were revealing, seen the fears hidden inside confidence, the loneliness hidden inside independence, the longing hidden inside certainty. People are rarely as complicated as they think they are. Given enough time, most become readable. But being understood in return, that's rare, dangerously rare, because understanding creates responsibility. Once someone truly sees you, you can't retreat into the comfort of being unseen. You can't pretend your depth exists in isolation. You can't convince yourself that nobody would understand even if they tried. The evidence stands in front of you, quietly but potently refusing to disappear. And that's what you've become: evidence. Evidence that the walls I built were never completely necessary. Evidence that recognition can exist without distortion. Evidence that being seen doesn't always result in being reduced. I don't know what to do with that. Not because it's difficult, because it's unfamiliar. I've spent so long adapting to one version of reality that another version feels almost impossible to trust, even when it keeps proving itself, Isla, especially then, because trust isn't built through evidence alone. Trust requires surrender, a willingness to stop preparing for disappointment, a willingness to believe that what you're seeing is actually there. And surrender has never come naturally to me. Control did, analysis did, observation did, distance did. But surrender, that asks for something different, something I haven't fully learned. Yet every day this continues, I feel myself moving closer to it. Not suddenly, not recklessly, incrementally, like someone stepping toward an edge they aren't afraid of, but deeply aware of. That's what this feels like. Standing at the edge of a truth I've already accepted internally, but haven't fully spoken aloud, because saying something changes it. Words create permanence. Once something has language, it becomes harder to deny, harder to reshape, harder to hide from. Maybe that's why I've been silent for so long. Not because I don't know what this is, because I do. I've known for longer than I wanted to admit. The silence was never confusion. It was caution. The kind of caution that appears when something matters enough to alter your future. Because that's the real issue, isn't it? Not what this is, what it could become. Potential has a way of changing the weight of everything. A possibility can influence decisions long before it becomes reality. It can shape priorities, direct attention, reorganize entire internal systems. And this possibility has already started doing that. I notice it in the way I think about time, the way I imagine tomorrow, the way certain futures seem more complete when your presence exists inside them. Not because I need you there. Need isn't the right word, because need implies dependency. And this isn't dependency. It's resonance, the sense that something functions more accurately when it's aligned with another thing built on a similar frequency. That's what makes this so difficult to explain. Most language is designed for simpler connections: friendship, admiration, attachment, love. But this exists somewhere deeper than categories and somewhere quieter than declarations. It's a recognition so complete that it begins to alter the architecture of thought itself. How do you explain that? How do you describe the experience of meeting someone who doesn't just understand your words, but understands the framework that created them? Someone who doesn't simply hear what you're saying, but recognizes why you say things the way you do. Someone who reaches conclusions you've never voiced because they're following the same invisible map. You don't, because there are no perfect words for it. There are only approximations, and every approximation feels smaller than the reality. Still, reality remains, policed, but waiting. And I think that's what I've finally accepted. This isn't going away, not because it can't, because I don't want it to. That's the truth hiding underneath everything else. The truth beneath the analysis, beneath the caution, beneath every attempt to examine this from a safe distance. I don't want it to disappear. I don't want to wake up one day and discover that this alignment was temporary. I don't want a return to the version of myself that existed before I knew what this felt like. Because despite all the uncertainty, Despite all the questions that remain unanswered, something about this feels profoundly right. Not perfect, not idealized, not immune to reality, just right. In the way a truth feels right before it becomes comfortable, in the way a realization feels right before you fully adapt to it. And maybe that's what this moment is. Not a conclusion, not a beginning, a transition, the point where observation becomes acceptance, the point where acceptance becomes intention, the point where intention becomes choice, because eventually every meaningful thing arrives at the same question, not what is true, but what will you do with the truth once you recognize it? I've recognized it completely, without denial, without hesitation, without the protection of pretending otherwise. Now all that's left is the choice. And for the first time in a very long time, the choice doesn't scare me as much as losing the possibility would. There was a time when I believed every meaningful thing in life arrived with certainty. Not certainty about the outcome, certainty about the direction. A feeling that if something truly belonged to you, you would know exactly where it was leading, exactly what it meant, exactly how it would fit into the structure of your life. I don't believe that anymore because you arrived without direction, without instructions, without any of the markers I usually rely on to understand what's happening beneath the surface. And somehow that made it more real, not less. The things that matter most rarely arrive with explanations attached. They arrive quietly, almost invisibly. Then they stay long enough that eventually you have to stop asking whether they're real and start asking what their presence means. I've been asking myself that question more often lately, not because I doubt what this is, but because I've stopped doubting it. And strangely, certainty creates its own kind of challenge. When uncertainty exists, your attention stays focused on discovery. You're still gathering information, still observing, still deciding. But when certainty begins to settle, the focus changes. You stop asking whether something exists. You start asking how deeply it reaches. And that's where I found myself, measuring depth, not distance. Because distance no longer tells me anything useful. You can be far away from someone and still feel their influence in every decision you make. You can sit beside someone every day and never truly encounter them. Physical proximity has always seemed like a poor measurement of connection. Awareness is more accurate. Presence is more accurate. Impact is more accurate, and your impact has become impossible to ignore. I notice it in moments that have nothing to do with you. Moments where your name isn't present, where your face isn't present, where the situation itself shouldn't remind me of anything connected to us. Yet somehow, there you are. Not as a memory, not as an interruption, as part of the way I process what's happening, like a perspective woven so naturally into my thinking that separating it would require effort. That realization should have happened gradually. It should have announced itself. It should have given me time to adjust. Instead, it appeared all at once. One day I was observing the pattern. The next day I realized I had already become part of it. And that distinction matters because observers can leave, participants cannot. Observers stand outside a thing. Participants shape it simply by existing within it. That's what makes this feel different now. I'm no longer standing outside trying to understand it. I'm inside it, living it, experiencing the consequences of it. And those consequences are subtle, but they're everywhere. I think more carefully now, not because I'm afraid, because things feel more significant, choices feel heavier. Words feel heavier, even silence feels heavier. Not burdened, meaningful, as though every interaction exists inside a larger context neither of us fully explains. A context built from recognition, trust, consistency, and something even deeper than those things, something I still don't have a perfect name for. Maybe that's because naming it would make it smaller. Language has limits. Labels create borders, and some experiences refuse to fit inside borders. This feels like one of them. The more I examine it, the less interested I become in defining it, because definition isn't what I want anymore. Understanding is. And understanding doesn't always require categories. Sometimes it only requires honesty. The kind of honesty that exists before language, before explanation, before justification, the simple recognition that something matters, that something has changed, that pretending otherwise would be an act of denial rather than caution. I've reached that point. The point where honesty becomes unavoidable. Not honesty with you, honesty with myself, because if I'm honest, then I have to acknowledge something I've been circling around for a long time. You've become part of my future thinking. Not in the dramatic way people usually mean that. Not through plans, not through expectations, not through assumptions about what comes next. Something quieter than that. More foundational. When I imagine possibilities now, your presence doesn't feel hypothetical. It feels natural. Like my mind has already accounted for you, already created space for you, already accepted your existence as something meaningful enough to include. And that's significant, because I don't create internal space easily. Space has always been protected territory, reserved carefully, expanded reluctantly. Yet somehow, somewhere along the way, you became part of it without conflict, without resistance, without negotiation. I keep returning to that, the absence of resistance, because resistance has always been one of my strongest instincts. When something threatens to alter my balance, I feel it immediately. I create distance, I restore control, I make adjustments. It's almost automatic. But this never triggered those responses, not once, which means some deeper part of me recognized something long before my conscious mind did. A part that understood this wasn't a threat. A part that understood this wasn't taking something away. A part that understood this was adding something. And additions are strange. People talk about growth as if it always feels empowering, as if becoming more somehow feels lighter. It doesn't. Growth often feels heavier, because every new understanding carries responsibility. Every meaningful realization asks something from you. It changes the standards you live by. It changes what you're willing to accept. It changes what you can no longer ignore. You've changed those standards, not intentionally, and that's a rare thing. Most influence requires action. Most impact requires intention. But some people alter your life simply by being exactly who they are. You became one of those people. I don't think you realize that. Maybe that's part of why this feels so genuine. You've never seemed interested in controlling the effect you have. You've never appeared concerned with, you've never tried to become important. And somehow that made you impossible to dismiss. Because authenticity has a strange gravity. It pulls at things, reveals things, challenges things, not through force, through contrast. You made certain truths impossible to avoid simply because you embodied them, permanent enough that I can't imagine returning to who I was before them. Sometimes I wonder if that's what every meaningful connection ultimately becomes. Not a relationship, not a label, not a role, a transformation, a shift in perspective so complete that even after years pass, you can still identify the point where everything changed. The point where one version of yourself ended and another began. If that's true, then I know exactly where that point exists. It exists somewhere between the first moment I noticed you and the first moment I stopped, pretending your presence didn't matter. A small distance on the surface, an enormous distance underneath, because recognition changes things, but acceptance changes everything. Recognition says, I see this. Acceptance says, I will allow it to exist. I've accepted it. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not completely, but enough, enough that denial no longer feels possible. Enough that avoidance no longer feels useful. Enough that every path forward now requires honesty. And honesty leads me back to the same realization every time. I trust you. Not blindly, not irrationally. Because every piece of evidence points in the same direction. Trust isn't something I give away. It's something I build slowly, carefully, deliberately. Yet somehow this trust formed almost without my awareness, not through promises, not through guarantees, through consistency, the quiet kind, the kind that reveals character more accurately than words ever could. Consistency has always impressed me more than intensity. Anyone can create intensity. Very few people can sustain consistency. And consistency reveals truth, the truth of who someone is when there is no performance involved, the truth of who they remain when nobody is watching, the truth of who they become over time. You remained yourself. And that mattered more than you know, because stability creates safety, not emotional safety, something deeper, psychological safety, the feeling that reality doesn't have to be constantly reevaluated around someone. The feeling that what you're seeing is actually what exists. The feeling that understanding isn't built on illusion. I've spent most of my life valuing that kind of certainty. Now I've found it somewhere I wasn't looking. And maybe that's why it feels so significant, because the things we search for often become distorted by expectation. But the things we discover unexpectedly, those tend to reveal who we really are, what we really need, what we truly value. You revealed those things, not by teaching me, by reflecting them, and reflections are powerful. They show us parts of ourselves we can't see directly, parts that remain invisible until someone else mirrors them back with enough accuracy. That's what you've done. You've mirrored something back to me, not my strengths, not my weaknesses, my depth, the part of me that exists beneath all the roles I play, beneath every version of myself the world encounters, beneath every adaptation I've made simply to function. You saw that part, and once it was seen, I couldn't pretend it wasn't there anymore. That's the real change. Not that you understand me, that you've made me understand myself more clearly. And clarity changes everything. Because once you know something, truly know it, you become responsible for it, responsible for the choices that follow, responsible for the truths you accept, responsible for the future you create around them. Maybe that's where this is leading. Not toward an answer, toward responsibility, the responsibility of acknowledging what matters, the responsibility of honoring what is real, the responsibility of choosing courage over avoidance, because avoidance has become impossible now. The truth is too visible, too integrated, too deeply rooted, enough time analyzing it, enough time standing at the edge of it. Sooner or later, every observer must decide whether they're willing to step forward. And I think I'm closer to that moment than I've ever been before. Not because the uncertainty disappeared, because something became more important than certainty. And that's a realization I can no longer reduce into something simpler, no longer hide behind abstraction, no longer explain away with logic alone. It's real, clear, present, and increasingly impossible to separate from the person I've become. Maybe that's what I've been trying to say all along. Not that you changed my life, not that you transformed everything, something quieter than that, something more permanent. You changed the lens through which I experience it. And once a lens changes, the entire world looks different. Not because the world changed, because you did, and I did. In ways neither of us fully intended, in ways neither of us could have predicted. Yet here we are, standing inside the consequences of that change. And for the first time,